Brian Clark on aging.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? So let me thank everybody for coming. I've actually never been to one of these. I'm embarrassed to say that, but I am thoroughly impressed with the turnout. As Dr. Wyatt said, I'm going to talk a little bit about healthy aging in the 21st century to give you an overview of sort of what to expect. I'm going to first talk about some of my laboratory's research. I want to give folks an understanding sort of what day-to-day scientists do that are doing the kind of work I do. Then I'm going to pivot about halfway through and go to applied stuff. I get asked to give talks like this in the community all the time, but most of the folks in this room were about 50 to 60 years younger than what I'm used to talking to. I'm normally talking to folks in their 80s and 90s about what they can do to maintain physical independence, to stay out of a nursing home, to improve their physical capacity. So a lot of my talk is going to be focused really towards that sort of an audience. So for those of you that are in your 20s, you're thinking, wow, that's not me, I'm so far away. But trust me, decades fly by. People say time flies by. I tell you, decades fly by. And if you don't buy that, think about your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents perhaps, and try to take home some tidbits of advice. Let's see. So before I get into my talk, knowing that many of you are undergraduate students, I thought I'd give a little bit of background about the path I've taken to end up with the work that I'm doing today. So I started out, well, we all started out being born, right? But I started out my undergraduate academic career studying biology at a medium-sized state school in the western part of North Carolina. It really had a huge, heavy ecology focus. I was really digging ecology, ornithology, or the study of birds in particular. And I think I was a senior in college, and I was kind of thinking of going on to grad school in the ecology space, but at the same time, I was taking an animal physiology class that I thought was fascinating. The reason I thought it was fascinating is because I was also a distance runner, and it was the first time I had ever taken a class that I started to see relevance to what I spent 30, 40 hours a week doing. And so I started taking that, and I got interested in exercise physiology. I'd never taken a class in exercise physiology. But I ended up applying to graduate school at Syracuse University and went there for my ex-phys degree. Because I had never taken a class, they wouldn't accept me. They said, you got to take some prereqs first. You're not ready to start a graduate program in exercise physiology. I had never taken human anatomy physiology. I'd never taken exercise physiology. So they told me to go take some prereqs at a community college because it was cheaper, and to sit in on a couple of classes at Syracuse where I didn't have to pay for a semester. So I did that, and I really dug it, and I started my master's degree in exercise physiology. I did that. About halfway through that, I realized I was passionate about research. I really enjoyed science. So I stayed on for my PhD there. Really, at that point, starting to focus in on muscle and nerve physiology. I got really interested in the regulation of how the nervous system controls muscles and how both of these systems adapt to increases in physical activity as well as decreases in physical activity. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm doing aging work today. A little bit of that had to do with shifts in funding. I was really interested actually in physical inactivity. And my earliest work was focusing on microgravity and space flight. I got interested in the effects of zero activity and how that affected the system. And then I was at Ohio, and I think it was in 2007, NASA came out and said we're cannibalizing our extramural research program, and we're doing all of our own in-house work, which I fully actually support today. It hurt at the time, but today I fully support that because it's really hard for someone at an institution to really understand some of the nitty-gritty specifics of what NASA needs. You really need to be in their interior space to understand their microcosm. And I was sort of stepping back and saying, okay, how do I take everything I've done to date and apply it to something that is fundable and relevant and that I'm interested in? And it didn't take too long for me to stumble upon my tool bag being able to be applied to aging. And so that kind of gives you an idea of how I got to where I am today, or the kind of work that I'm doing. Now, today I don't just do aging research. I sort of describe myself as doing translational research. That's because I feel like I sit between the bench, or the basic sciences, and the bedside. I'm not a physician. I'm a physiologist by training, but 99% of the work I do is done in human subjects, frequently patient populations. So my real interest is in taking the insights that we glean from basic science and doing things like first-in-human studies to see if it translates to humans. Or sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes it may be taking things that we're seeing humans doing, or that we're seeing epidemiologically or in broad culture, and seeing if it translates back to the basic sciences. So I sort of tout myself as a translational physiologist, or a human physiologist, broadly speaking. Before I get too far, though, I want to talk a little bit about a research institute that I direct called the Ohio Musculoskeletal and Neurological Institute. And for a few folks here, you'll know it as OMNI, because that's a lot easier to pronounce than Ohio Musculoskeletal and Neurological Institute. But this institute's mission is to improve the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of musculoskeletal and neurological disorders. As most of you probably know, that's about a third of medicine. I mean, that's a huge space that we're trying to cover. But we have heavy foci in both pain and aging. And to give you an idea of sort of what these two different foci do, our folks working in the pain space are really focused in on understanding what causes pain, as well as different ways to effectively mitigate pain non-surgically. So that's really the space that we're working in here, is how do we mitigate pain and what causes it, particularly from a non-surgical and non-pharmacological approach. Our aging research program similarly is focusing in on the causes or the mechanisms of a variety of different age-related changes, as well as how do we enhance physical function, cognitive function, and overall well-being in the elderly as we get older. This work has a heavy focus on what I refer to as frailty and fractures. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the frailty end today, and I'm not going to talk much about the fracture work, but we do have work going in the bone health space as well as the muscle and nerve space. So the name of my talk was Age of Champions, and I've always used this slide when I put this up. Anybody venture to guess how old this lady doing the long jump is? 92 years old. This lady, she passed away a few years ago, but back 5 years or so ago, she was the senior Olympic record holder for the long jump. I cannot jump as far as she could. Her name was Olga, and she was from one of the Scandinavian countries. But I always put this up to give an example of what healthy aging looks like. And I would be willing to venture a guess that there's not hardly, unless you're a track and field athlete in college, there's not many folks in this room that could jump as far as Olga could in her 90s. So I'm going to pivot and talk to you a little bit about my personal research. So my work is heavily focused on muscle function, particularly muscle weakness, muscle fatigue resistance. Why do we care about that? Muscle weakness increases the relative risk of you not being able to live independently in your own home by a factor of 2.2. So if you have low levels of muscle strength, you can't get out of a chair. If you have low levels of muscle strength, you can't climb a flight of steps, much less can you go to Kroger and get your groceries and get back home. I don't know the exact percentage, but if you go to many assisted living and nursing home facilities, a lot of folks in those facilities are there because they're too weak, or they're too exhausted to live independently. So a lot of our work has really focused in on what causes the weakness, what causes the physical function losses. Now, logically, many people may think it's muscle size, right? If muscles get smaller as we get old, which we'll talk about in a second, that's certainly one of the players. But if we look to see how much does muscle size alone predict physical disability, it's a factor-fold less. It's only about a 30% increase if you have low muscle mass. And I'm going to go back to my picture of Olga here. Olga's not that big. Olga's a fairly slight lady here who clearly is not having difficulties with muscle strength or skeletal muscle performance. What I'm saying is nothing new in terms of loss of muscle. I always use this slide of Shakespeare from the 1600s where he describes the loss of muscle tissue as we get older. So some of these observations have been around for centuries. And indeed, we do know that as we get older, muscles get a lot smaller. If you're a guy in this room in your 20s, you can expect that if you make it to 90, your muscles are going to be about half the amount of your total body that you've got today. If you're a woman, you're not going to lose quite as much, about a 15% loss. But one of the things to note is that with time, we start to equilibrate a little bit. So what determines how much muscle you have? Who wants to venture a guess? If you can make sense of this slide, who wants to venture a guess on what determines the amount of muscle that you have? Protein. So muscle is largely made of protein. You're right. It's a combination of how much protein is your body making and how much are you breaking down. So you can probably guess that if you want to stimulate or increase the amount of protein your body's making, what do you need to do? What's an absolute requirement if you want to increase the amount of proteins that your body is making? Consume it. You got to eat it. Yeah, you have to eat protein. That's a big problem. Most of the folks in this room, you're not protein deficient. Most folks that are young, middle-aged, they get plenty of protein. But many elderly are incredibly protein deficient. So I'm going to talk about that at the end when I get to some of the applied stuff. The other thing you commonly have to do is you have to give your muscles a stimulus to adapt, exercise. Combination of those two things are major factors. But what this slide is trying to show is that to maintain your muscle mass, your body has to make the same amount as it's degrading. And then over here, it's giving a broad overview of the variety of different things that can contribute to muscle loss, which is commonly referred to as sarcopenia with age. These are the two easily modifiable factors, right? The amount of your nutrition and your activity. I'm going to harp on that this whole time. But even if you do these two things, there's still changes that occur that are going to have physiological effects. Some of these are at the muscle level, some of these are at the neurological level or the nervous system, and some of these are various hormonal and immunological changes. So for the better part of 40 years, it was logically assumed that the muscle wasting or loss as we get older is tightly linked to the reductions in physical performance. And I would say that within the geriatric gerontology field, that was really the thought process up until about 10 years ago. And I'd say even to this day, it's still largely by many people, particularly practicing geriatricians, what they would think. But this is some work done by a colleague of mine at the University of Florida where they just tested a whole ton of people, thousands of people, and they looked at the relationship between muscle strength and muscle mass, and it was decent, right? This thing is showing that about half the variance or half of the between-person variability in muscle strength is being explained by muscle size. But when we look at this that's in a cross-sectional study, right? That's the kind of study we would do if we took everybody in this room, we measured your muscle strength, we measured your muscle size, and we plotted them on a graph. What would happen, though, if we took everybody in this room and we measured you today and we brought you back 5 years later? That's really, from a scientific perspective, that's a better study design, right? We're actually following people over time. Well, this is what they did in this particular study. They tracked nearly 1,700 people in the United States over a 5-year period. This is data from a study called the Health ABC study. It's a fascinating study because they would drive a transfer truck all around the nation to test you. And in this transfer truck, they had everything from MRIs to strength testing equipment, all kinds of stuff. The ABC part stood for aging and body composition. This study is still going on, but this is some data from where they actually followed the same people over a 5-year period. And what they observed was that, and everybody, when they started this study, they had to be at least 70 or 75. Okay, so you had to be 70 or 75 when you started. They followed you over time. What they observed was that some people lost weight, some people gained weight. The people that lost weight lost muscle size, shown here, and they lost muscle strength. The people that gained weight gained muscle size, but they still lost muscle strength at almost the same rate. So, anybody want to draw a conclusion from that slide? I was told to try to get people to talk, so I'm doing my best. They're all sedentary? It could be. I don't know. I don't know what's going on there. But in terms of this relationship between muscle mass and muscle strength, anybody want to try and draw a conclusion?
Mass and strength are not directly linked together.
Right. The question, the answer was mass and strength are not directly linked together. That's right. We've got a dissociation, right? They're not following each other or tracking each other. So I had been talking to my buddy at Florida for years about this, and finally we decided that we wanted to try to change some of this thinking, and we approached a guy at the National Institutes on Aging, Luigi Ferrucci, and told him we wanted to write a provocative article on this. And they told us to write it. They called it a green banana. The reason they called it a green banana article is this was this provocative sort of type of journal article that they had where they expected some of the ideas to ripe, but most of them to die and fall off the tree. So I thought that was interesting. But in this, we basically made the case that we needed to stop thinking of how people had been thinking of sarcopenia. People had started thinking of it as the age-related loss of muscle mass and strength, and that we needed to have a paradigm shift, and we needed to stop using that terminology. And actually, we proposed our own terminology in this article called dynapenia, arguing that we needed to use a different term for the loss of strength or muscle function and keep the original definition of sarcopenia, which was muscle mass. This article and the ones that sort of follow, I think they've been cited several thousand times now. There are people that hate me for this. There are some old school folks who really thought we muddied the water, that thought we took the field back 15 years because we were confusing particularly the practicing geriatricians. I think most of them have forgiven me now because the data has consistently come out over the past 10 years and shown that they need to be thought of conceptually separately. But it was indeed provocative. And in this article, we proposed that there were a lot of factors contributing to muscle weakness. Down here, you'll see this muscle wasting or this sarcopenia. And people used to just argue that these two things were one and the same. And in this figure, we were trying to show that no, there's all kinds of other things going on with muscle, all kinds of things going on in the nervous system that are ultimately determining sort of skeletal muscle performance or physical performance in the elderly. So that's sort of my broad overview. I want to tell you a little bit about the work that we've done at OU over the past 10 years to try to better understand the causes of muscle weakness in the elderly. So one of the things when you do human research, you have to use very different tools and technologies than what many of the biology students in this classroom may think of. It's impossible, if I want to know what's going on in the brain, I can't just drill somebody's skull open, go in with a biopsy needle and take a piece of tissue, right? You have to use very different, typically non-invasive or minimally invasive tools to gain insight. So one of our tools is transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is pretty cool. What you actually have is 2 copper coils that will run a rapidly changing electrical current through them. And when you have that, it generates a rapidly changing magnetic field. And if you put a rapidly changing magnetic field over any excitable tissue, muscle, brain, peripheral nerve, it doesn't matter, it induces an action potential. So we can take something like this, put it over somebody's brain, shock the brain, and make the muscles contract. And so this is one of the technologies we've used for years to get insight into the nervous system. And this is some data from 7 years or so ago. where we did this, and this is what the electrophysiological signals look like. So if any of you are used to looking at an action potential, this is what an action potential recorded from electrodes placed over a muscle in a human would look like when you electrically stimulate or magnetically impulse the brain. What you'll see is this little spike here, that's when we put the pulse into the brain. Depending on the muscle we're recording from, 10 to 25 milliseconds later, we'll get a motor evoked response. That's the muscle directly contracting. But you'll also notice that this electrical signal goes quiet. Notice over here it's moving around, here it's flat. This is something we call the silent period, and it's insight into the brain and how excitable it is. So the size of this thing and the time period that it stays quiet tells us a lot about what's going on with various receptors in the brain. And in this particular study, we reported that when compared to young, older adults had a longer silent period, which suggests the brain's not as excitable. Now, today, I hate these studies. I absolutely hate studies that compare old to young, because as I always say to the folks that work with me, we know it's going to be different. It's boring. It's not telling us anything at a real detailed level. It's just too superficial and descriptive. And a little bit later, I'm going to try to hone in a little bit more specifically on what's going on here. But we also measure other kinds of things with this brain stimulation technique. And I'm not going to get into the weeds here because I'll put you to sleep. But effectively, these are different ways where we'll put in two brain pulses real close together, and we'll look to see how one pulse alters the other pulse. And folks have done studies with various compounds and drugs to understand what each of these tells us about different receptors. But this is another one of the key findings. This thing called LICI is another finding we have consistently found to be different between young and old adults. And the finding that I just showed you with this one continues to make the argument that there's something different about the excitability of the nervous system, particularly within the part of the brain that controls the muscles or the primary motor cortex. So another question that we're frequently interested in is how well do people activate their muscles? So if I had somebody pull up on some device as hard as they can, and if I wanted to know whether their nervous system was activating their muscles maximally, anybody got ideas of how I could test that? I shock them. I electrically shock the muscle, and it's not fun. We do it on a daily basis, but what we'll do is we'll have somebody pull up as hard as they can. We'll have a couple of rubber pads on their arm. While they're pulling up, we basically jack the muscle with a bunch of electrical stimulation. And when I say jack it, I mean we've got the electrical stimulator turned up to where we're activating every single muscle fiber. We turn it up until it doesn't get any bigger, so we know we're doing it. And we even put two of those pulses in 10 milliseconds apart. Do people come back for it? Yeah, people come back, actually. If you're kind to people and if they understand the benefit, they come back, and it only lasts for 10 milliseconds. And one of the things that I find is that the older we get, the tougher we get. I've done these techniques on people ever from 18 to 94 probably. And I would say inevitably, no offense to the college students, you guys are a little wimpier than the older adults. Typically by the time you're in your 70s, 80s, 90s, you've experienced pain, and a little thing like this is nothing compared to childbirth or having a tractor fall on your leg or whatever it may be. So yeah, it's a very different perspective. So we'll do this, and we'll calculate how well somebody can activate their muscles. And this was a paper I did with a colleague in Australia 6 years ago, and we were wanting to synthesize all the data that's ever been done between young and old adults on this. And in many cases, you'll notice, like this triangle here is the same data set here, and you'll notice that in many cases, older adults are able to fully activate their muscle. But in a few of these cases, they were lower. So that led us to want to look into what I call the heterogeneity of aging, and this is something we're still really pursuing. Not everyone ages at the same rate. You can take some people at 70 And you'll hear things like 70 is the new 50. You'll take some people at 70 and they're as physically capable as people in their 40s and 50s. On the other hand, you can take some people at 50 and they're as in poor health as some folks in their 80s. So this is sort of my example. Up here is Olga again in her 90s. This is a lady in her 80s, 80 years old, coming down to the sort of the frail elderly. So when we look at how do people vary, we did this study, actually this was published 2 years ago, where we tested about 50 people from Athens. They came into the lab over a bunch of visits, we tested them, but we measured this ability to activate the muscle. And one of the things that we observed is that if we simply broke people into the stronger people and the lower people, just 2/3 of them are in this category, 1/3 in this category, the weaker individuals were not able to activate their muscles at the same level as the stronger individuals. And we observed that these sort of brain excitability measures followed a similar pattern, again suggesting sort of a mechanism to it or a potential therapeutic target. I'm not going to present it here, but we've done similar studies with college students where we'll take college students and we'll put them in a cast for a month. So we will experimentally induce muscle weakness and we'll measure these things before and after, and we see a similar phenomenon. We see that weakness associated with aging as well as weakness associated with physical inactivity seems to be following this same paradigm. I'm not going to show this again. We've also shown that if we take college students and we put them in a cast, but we have them come into the lab about 5 days a week and simply think about doing exercise, they don't actually do it, they just imagine that they're contracting their muscles, that we can mitigate about 50% of the loss of strength just by getting you to think about it. So I don't want to, I've talked so far mostly about the brain, right? I've talked about what's going on here. I don't want to minimize the role of your peripheral nervous system. So your peripheral nervous system, it's what I call a motor unit. And these are the little nerves that branch off the spinal cord that go down and innervate or control your muscle fibers. And as we get older, it's long been thought that these motor units die and that some of the other ones will come in and innervate and some of them just completely die and the muscle fibers that are controlling them die as well. But it's not been linked to weakness. It's been assumed to be linked to weakness and function, but it's not been linked to do that so much. So this was a study we did a few years back where we obtained an estimate of motor units. You can't directly measure it, right? In a human, I can't go out and cut you in half and stain your spinal cord and actually count the nerves. So we have to use techniques to try to estimate this. So we did this technique to estimate it. And we also measured muscle strength of the pinch grip muscles. And we observed that there was an interrelationship between motor unit number and muscle strength in older adults, but not younger adults. And I would argue that's because many of these younger adults have optimal amounts. I'm going to pivot to my get you active and get you healthy talk in a second. But people find this cool, so I'll quickly point this out. Not only can we measure brain excitability, but we can modulate or change brain excitability. This is using a technique called transcranial direct current stimulation, where you pass a small electrical current. It's not going to make the muscles contract. Feels for the first 10, 15 seconds, it feels a little itchy when we first turn it on, then it kind of goes away. But we can modulate excitability with this device. So this was my first work in this. I had a PhD student years ago who wanted to look and see whether we could use this sort of brain stimulation device to increase muscle endurance or fatigue resistance in young, healthy college kids. And indeed, she proved her hypothesis. And so then I thought, well, I want to know if this works in the elderly. So we did this on a group of older adults. And indeed, we found that we got about a 15 or 20% increase in muscle endurance. So we just asked somebody to hold a muscle contraction as long as they could. On 2 different days, we randomized the order. We blinded ourselves to it so that we didn't know whether we were stimulating or turning the stimulator off. And we found that we were able to increase endurance. And perhaps most interestingly, that increase in endurance came from the weakest people. So this is looking at the difference between the 2 conditions and strength level going in. and it was the weakest people who were able to increase their endurance capacity by modulating their brain excitability. So lastly, I don't want to ignore the muscle, just like I didn't want to ignore the peripheral nervous system. Muscle is very, very important. It has a wide range of functions from metabolism to a protein reserve. This is some work we've done looking at a compound being developed to try to promote muscle growth. There's 5 of these compounds actually in the pipeline. We did this with 4 other institutions nationwide: Harvard, Tufts, Florida, and Washington University, St. Louis. And as I told these guys, I was glad they were able to be part of our team. So this compound is thought to change a protein in the body that binds up and prevents muscles from growing. It's called myostatin. It's a gene that regulates a protein. These are the same breed of dog. This dog here is not expressing myostatin. It's a knockout dog. And you can see it's commonly they're referred to as doubly muscled, and this guy certainly is. And many people think when I talk about increasing muscle, they think about athletes, but I always try to make the case that this isn't about athletic performance. This can be about life and death with many different disease states. This is somebody with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Respiration muscles are having to work so hard that they're catabolic. They're always losing weight. So this is where these kind of compounds can have therapeutic effect. In this study, we measured everything under the sun, ranging from DEXA scans to measure body composition, echocardiograms to look at the heart, MRIs, and this was over time in 4 different groups where we would give injections of this drug. This was over here in Irvine Hall. People sometimes don't realize we do this kind of work at OU. We were giving injections of this drug over a 12-week period every 2 weeks to folks, and we did observe that it increased muscle mass. If we look at the MRI data here, these 2 groups are the ones that got the drug. One of them did a little bit of exercise with it. These were the 2 placebos. But this is also the same data, except it was measured a different way. Here we measured muscle size with MRI. Here we measured it with an X-ray based approach called dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, or DEXA. And I point this out because the black line was a placebo. This was a $20 million study, mind you. And the placebo group increased their muscle size. I don't know why. I cannot tell you. But I can tell you that we had a $20 million study that got significantly muddled because the placebo group, for whatever reason, increased their muscle mass. I'm going to skip that. So let me pivot, and now let's talk about what you can do to improve your health, or what your parents or grandparents can do. I always say lifestyle medicine is the key. I've talked about drugs, I've talked about the nervous system. Forget that stuff. Lifestyle is the key here. This is a poster, if you can't see it, it says "Growing Old is Not for Sissies," with a man with a couple of barbells in his hand and a lady that's been swimming, coupled with some good nutritious food in the middle. And this is a slide I always show the medical students, thank you, John, that I always show the medical students when I lecture to them, which is a physician saying, what fits your busy schedule better, exercising 1 hour a day or being dead 24 hours a day? I will say, you know what the number one cause or number one reason people give for not exercising? Number one reason people give for not exercising? No time. That's correct. That's what they give. But do you realize that the most busy people are the ones that exercise? Just food for thought. So some of you may have seen these graphs, but I'm going to use these because it's an epidemic, and we're facing it now, and it's going to continue to get worse. This is an obesity map of the United States in 1986. So many of you were not born then. The states in white, we didn't have data on. The states in light blue, 1 out of 10 people were obese. And the states in the darker blue, 10 to 14% of the population were obese. Now, I'm going to flip through this about 5 years at a time. I want you to note how this map has changed over recent years. 1987. Now, a little bit of this in 1987 is just states that we didn't have data on, we're getting data on, but you'll notice a lot more of the medium-sized blue, 1988, 1989, 1990, 1991. You're seeing a lot more dark colors, right? You're now seeing a 15 to 19% category with several states falling into that. 92, 93, 94, 95, 96. It's not looking good, right? Half the state is already in the 15 to 19%. Remember, we had some states that were less than 10% before. They're all gone. 97, we've got a new category now, greater than 20%. 98, 99, 2000, 2001. Now we've got 1 out of 4 people in some states being obese. Colorado is the only state that is at a level that was our highest back 15 years before. 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. This is the latest year I have. They have them up through here, but the story keeps getting worse and more depressing, so I stopped there. Now we've got all kinds of new categories, greater than 30%. None of the 2 original categories even exist anymore. So we have an obesity epidemic. Within the aging world, we talk about 2 ships are going to collide. We've got the obesity epidemic coming in, and then we've got the, whether you want to call it dynapenia or sarcopenia, colliding with that. And if you go on Medline and look up sarcopenic obesity or dynapenic obesity, they're both becoming common phrases to describe either the older adult or the elderly person who is weak and fat or who is low muscle mass and fat. And that is really the epidemic that we're going to be facing in the coming years. We all know, or if we don't know, we should know that obesity has a massive impact on health. This is showing that your risk of type 2 diabetes skyrockets with increased body mass index. Body mass index is how big you are relative to your height. But it's also things like hypertension, coronary heart disease. The list goes on and on. Now, I should note, I always show this because I'm used to talking to folks in their 80s and 90s, that if we look at the relationship between death here and body mass index, if you look at this in a young, healthy population, it doesn't look like a U. It looks more like this, where the more obese you are, the more at risk you are for dying. The older we get a U-shaped curve, where if you have a very low body mass index, you are at very high risk of death. We tested a lady in the laboratory today whose sister or sister-in-law weighs 66 pounds. 66 pounds. There's no reserve, right? Very dangerous. So I always caution this for the elderly. We know that physical inactivity is linked to mortality. This was a paper published in JAMA more than 10 years ago showing that if you're not moving and using energy, you have an increased risk of death. This is nothing new. It's things we've known for years. There are 3 components to a good, well-rounded physical activity program. These are endorsed by both the American College of Sports Medicine as well as the Centers for Disease Control. It is getting aerobic exercise, so get up, get your heart rate moving, do it for a long period of time, helps improve body composition, do stuff that uses your muscles, lift weights, garden, I don't really care, but do something to be active, and don't ignore flexibility. Now, I don't have time to go through all this, but I'm going to try to give you a quick overview of some of the health benefits of this. If we look at how dense bones are, you'll see that if I just look at total body bone mineral density, runners, triathletes, people doing weight-bearing activity have increased bone health. One thing to point out, like with swimmers, for instance, here, you'll notice in some of these scenarios, they're actually lower than controls or sedentary people. It's because they're in water, right? They're buoyant. They're not loading the bone. So loading the bone is very critical for bone health. Similarly, if anybody has diabetes, one of the first things their doctor is going to tell you to do is to exercise. The reason for that is that exercise creates a signal cascade that takes a little cellular cellular protein to the exterior surface of the cell membrane to pull glucose out of the bloodstream. It's called the GLUT4 protein. It's what happens in many pharmacological. It's what many drugs are trying to do, but exercise or muscle contraction stimulates the same pathway. In terms of how to manage muscle wasting and muscle weakness, I talked about drugs, I've talked about a lot of things, but there's one thing that is well known to work, and that's good old-fashioned weightlifting. I have had people in their early to mid-90s perform high-intensity resistance exercise programs perfectly with no adverse events. This was an article we were invited to write about a year or two ago, and we wrote it, and we had one of these cautionary things in there about, oh, before you start an exercise program, everybody should seek their physician to get approval. We thought, okay, we're going to be cautious. The editor wrote me back and said, take that out. She says, we've got to get away from that. She goes, we've got to get away from people thinking that they always have to check with their doctor, that there's much more negative health effects from the risk of being inactive, and they told me to strike it. But the idea here is that if you can increase physical activity, that increases body mass as well as muscle strength and power. This will reduce fatigue, enhances motor performance, and that you can then create a good cycle that encourages health and well-being. Two key components to a good weightlifting program for the elderly. One is intensity. I observe a lot of community-based exercise programs in Athens as well as nationwide. In many cases, the intensity is too low, right? You go to some of these things and they're playing chair volleyball and they're counting it as exercise, and I highly encourage it, but do more. You've got to work harder. This is a study looking at the amount of strength to be gained, and you'll see that there's a positive relationship between each increment in intensity that's being done. And the other big component is volume. How much are you doing? So intensity and volume are clearly big aspects of promoting muscle growth and adaptation in the elderly with resistance exercise. Last but not least, I want to cover nutrition a little bit. I started the talk off asking about protein intake. Proteins are the building blocks of tissues. It is critical to have to promote muscle health, particularly in the elderly. We know that protein augments exercise. I always tell the older adults that I work with to eat some protein, a mixed meal preferably, right after they exercise. This is data showing that if you couple protein with exercise, you have an added benefit. The other big debate right now in the aging and muscle literature is how much protein do elderly need? This is the RDA, the recommended daily allowance for humans. Our recommended daily allowances are not varied by age. I would argue they should be. As we get older, we become anabolic resistance. We don't respond to protein at the same level. There are scientists out there that make the argument that the elderly should get nearly twice the amount of protein per day as someone that's in their 20s. Now, these recommended daily allowances are recommended daily. There are also scientists out there saying, forget talking about the recommended daily allowance, that we need to talk about the recommended meal protein requirements. That if I eat 80 grams of protein at dinner, that's not nearly as effective if I eat 20 or 25 grams at breakfast, 20 or 25 grams at lunch, so on and so forth. So this is the idea that you need to eat by the clock. Whenever I talk to a lot of older adults in the community, appetite goes down with aging, and particularly appetite for protein. I tell people, eat by the clock. Every 4, 5, 6 hours, get 20, 25 grams of protein. Even if you're not hungry, get the protein. That goes back to the 66-pound person I was talking about earlier. I told her sister today, same thing. Tell her to eat by the clock, even if it means setting a clock and reminding yourself. So then, of course, the questions I always get is, okay, what kind of protein should I eat? I'm not telling anyone here anything new. Lean sources of protein like salmon, chicken, eggs, cheeses, various beans and lentils, almonds. A lot of vegetarians and vegans in Athens. I get the question, I'm actually vegetarian, but I get a lot of questions in the community from the elderly about, I'm a vegetarian, how do I get enough protein? So I put this up showing things like tofu, garbanzo beans, soybeans, or edamame milk, so on and so forth. And I always put this up where, the non-meat sources, where do you get your protein, with the overweight, sedentary fat Americans asking the healthy family here. But there are also a lot of protein supplements where they've got various kinds of isolated proteins and powders that can easily be mixed in with water and other kinds of things to increase that. One more thing I want to harp on aging and physical activity. People frequently think, okay, I want to maintain my brain health, I'm going to do these Sudoku games. Evidence for that's not strong. The one thing that there is strong evidence for is aerobic activity. If anybody here knows Dr. Soar, Julie Soar in psychology, she's somebody that studies cognition and aging. I called her before I gave a talk to the community and I said, tell me one thing. She said, tell them to walk, be physically active. Good vascular health means good brain health. So that's my last keys: to be active and eat intelligently. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Questions? Anybody? Come on up. Hey, John.
Brian, I have to ask you a question. Putting an electrical pulse on the brain, I'm not sure I like that. And you're firing neurons for the muscle. What about cognition? Is there any effect on
So,
loss of memory or gain of?
yeah, so the question is if we put electrical impulses into the brain, is there any effect on cognition? That's actually a really hot area. And a lot of it depends on the part of the brain you stimulate. But there are studies where they will put and it also depends on the direction of the current. So if you're doing anodal versus cathodal, or excitatory versus non-excitatory, inhibitory. But if you do I'm scared to tell students this because this is a hot topic right now. If you stimulate the right part of the brain the right way, you can actually enhance cognition. That is, and you can Google it and YouTube it, and you'll see all kinds of little homemade devices where people have done this. Someone told me recently that there is a video game, I think it was one of the Asian nations, and I forget which one, but there's some sort of a video game that's really hot, and people have these massive competitions, and it's kind of like football in the United States, where people will come into these stadiums and watch people play these video games that involves a combination of both the motor processing but cognition as well. And they had to ban these things. People were using them as performance-enhancing devices. So that's sort of the acute effects. Now, the question that I've long wondered is, what is the potential negative effect, and what are they? They have done a fair number of pathology studies where they'll do these kind of procedures in animals and they don't see it. But that's only as good as the studies that are being done.
What are some of the theories that you have on the observation of that robust placebo effect that you observe? Is it somehow related to the phenomenon you described about the cast and then just imagining physical activity?
So the question was, in one of the studies, we had a robust placebo effect where the placebo group increased their muscle mass. And if I had any thoughts on what drove it, I do have thoughts on what drove it. I think it could be a bunch of things. One of them, it could be something I've not thought of. One of the explanations, I think, is there were 5 sites in that study. There was Athens, Ohio, there was University of Florida, there was Tufts, there was Harvard, and there was WashU St. Louis. 3 of those sites were the high enrolling sites. That was us, that was Harvard, and that was Tufts. That's where about 80% of the subjects in that particular study came from. We kicked our site off at I think it was in August of one year, and we ran for about 1 year. Tufts was the same way. Harvard did not come on until February. And they enrolled a massive amount of people. I mean, I'm talking like half the entire subjects came out of Harvard. They enrolled a massive amount of people in February, in Boston. So people have been physically inactive for the prior 3 months because it's cold, it's snowing, it's wet, and we're following them for a 3-month period, so the weather starts getting better. People naturally become more physically active. They get outside, they walk more, they start gardening. So one of my hypotheses is that it's a seasonal effect, that some of the placebo people probably came in at a time period, became more physically active, so it could have effectively been acting as though it was an exercise program. The other issue, and it's why you have placebo groups, is that anytime you tell someone, oh, we want you to do a study that's looking at muscle and physical function, we tell them not to exercise, we tell them not to change their diet, but we start giving them a drug. Some people naturally, like it or not, are going to start eating a little different. They're going to start exercising a little more. So it could be a combination of those two, or it could be a third totally unrelated thing.
So in relations to the dementia and the effect of motor activity and physical activity on dementia and sort of cognition, is that just a wiring and vasculature issue, like the neurons are firing better, or does it have anything to do with some of the issues that we know about in older brains with plaque buildup or sort of physical obstruction?
Yeah, if I had to guess, this is not my area, but if I had to guess, I think it has more to do with the vascular health, that if you have a brain that's getting good blood flow, good circulation, it's a healthier brain overall. One of the things that we know that in both the cognitive literature as well as the motor literature is a brain that has a bunch of white matter hyperintensity. So this is something where you would do an MRI scan, and you'll see these little hyper intense pixels on an MRI. That's thought to be largely due to these sort of small little infarcts or vascular damages that are occurring. And so we know that if you have a bunch of those, it impairs motor function, that it impairs cognitive function. So my hypothesis would be that it's a vascular health, and I'm certain that that's known. I just don't say it with great confidence because it's not my area.
What do you plan to research next?
What do we plan to research next? That's a good question. I skipped over my second or third to last slide. We have a massive study ongoing now called the UNCODE study, Unraveling the Neural Contributors of Dynapenia in Elders. That is a large study funded by the National Institutes of Health that is really focused in on understanding the brain physiology underlying these deficits with the elderly, as well as interventional strategies, particularly exercise and this mental practice on how that changes it. I'm also currently writing a grant looking more at the motor units. Everything I mostly presented was focused on the brain. I'm hoping to write a grant soon focused in on the spinal cord.
One last question. Go for it.
Haven't been here for the entire presentation, but I was here during the nutrition part of it. So I'm wondering, what is your take on protein powders? And are they good replacement for meats, for example?
Right. So the question is, what is my take on protein powders? Are they a good replacement for meat? I'm going to put on my aging hat. Okay, that's a little different than what I would probably tell most of the folks in this room. It's best to get your protein from healthy protein sources that are not necessarily synthesized in a factory. But if I put on my aging hat, it's really difficult for many elderly individuals to consume the protein they need by eating naturally occurring protein sources. A, the taste for it goes down. B, I showed that there's people that argue you should actually double your protein intake if you're very old. So that's a lot of protein. And then you also get this sort of a balance of, okay, if I'm getting too much, particularly meat-based protein, cholesterol is going to soar. So I think it depends on the individual. I regularly tell, I'll use an example of a friend of mine who is in an assisted living facility. And I recently encouraged him to use protein powders because he's dependent upon the meals that the assisted living facility provides. They're horrible. Not always, but generally they're horrible. He doesn't have a kitchen. So he was looking for that, and I said, go for this. This is simple. You can stir it in your little 6-ounce glass of water in your room. So I think it depends on the scenario. I mean, generally speaking, they're fairly, most of them are tested and fairly pure, but there's a lot of variation there.
Okay, with that, let's thank Dr. Clark one more time.